So I'd like to introduce Dr. Jim Ludes. Jim is the Vice President for Public Research and Initiatives and the Executive Director of the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University. And Jim is, he's got a great background in foreign policy. He was a legislative assistant to Senator Kerry for defense and foreign policy. He was a member of President-elect Obama's transition team, where he participated in the agency review team working inside the Department of Defense to identify critical issues that would need to be tackled by the new administration. He ran the confirmation team for the Department of Defense nominees selected for the roles of Deputy Secretary of Defense, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Comptroller, and General Counsel. He also coordinated defense policy issues for Senator Kerry's presidential campaign and assisted in the development of policies on military end strength, force structure, and improved benefits for military families. And the list of you know, credentials for him is a mile long. I'm just so appreciative that Jim is going to join us and help facilitate this discussion with Michael Dukakis. Michael Dukakis was born in Brookline and attended Brookline High School, where he was an honor student and a member of the basketball, baseball, tennis, and cross-country teams. As a 17-year-old senior in high school, he ran the Boston Marathon. Michael was also an Eagle Scout and recipient of the Distinguished Eagle Scout Award from Boy Scouts of America. He attended Swarthmore College with a BA in political science before enlisting in the United States Army, where he served in South Korea. Mike began his political career as an elected town meeting member in the town of Brookline. After graduating from Harvard Law School, he won election in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, serving from 1963 to 1971. And then he served as the 65th governor of Massachusetts from 1975 to 1979, and again from 1983 to 1991. He is the longest serving governor in Massachusetts history and only the second Greek-American governor in US history. He was nominated by the Democratic Party for president in the 1988 election. And while he was practicing law, Michael became partner at Hill and Barlow. And since leaving office, Governor Dukakis has served on the board of directors for Amtrak and has taught political science at Northeastern University and UCLA. And I am just thrilled to have Dr. Ludes and Governor Dukakis here to discuss some important issues. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to them.
Jim, you're on.
Well, I feel just humbled and privileged to be back here again and join Governor Dukakis tonight. I think he's the reason everybody's here, so I'm going to just follow his lead, and I'll be around to sort of ask some questions and to help moderate the conversation after he's done speaking. So Governor Dukakis, over to you.
I'll see if I can keep this brief. Obviously, if you have particular concerns about domestic policy, and who doesn't these days, and an election which is like none other, feel free to chime in. But I thought it might be interesting to at least take a look at American foreign policy, which has been almost totally ignored during this campaign. And it's so important. And I think it raises a lot of important questions for us and our future, especially what seems to be, under the Trump administration, a kind of withdrawal from kind of active, constructive, and consensus building kind of role when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, we're headed for another Cold War now, apparently, with China. I don't think we need another Cold War. Maybe it's the fact that I'm heading for my 87th year or 87th birthday, but you know, those of us in my generation lived through the Cold War. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't fun. It drained everybody of essential resources that we should have been using for other things. And to see us heading back into that especially after what seemed to me to be some pretty significant gains. The Paris Accords, which I thought were extremely important, the agreement with Iran to limit and really prohibit for an extended period of time their acquisition of nuclear arms. These were great foreign policy victories, it seemed to me, which was they were putting us on what seemed to me to be a path which was positive, constructive, and peaceful. And all of that has changed under the Trump administration. And while I think it's interesting that foreign policy has not played a particularly important role in the campaign for obvious reasons, my hope is that if, in fact, Joe Biden wins, that our role in foreign policy and our role as a peacemaker and a peace builder will return, and the United States will begin playing a much more constructive role in building a peaceful world. And a world, and I'm serious about this, a world that increasingly rules out war as a means for settling disputes between and among countries. We have too much to be concerned about, whether it's climate change or a whole series of things, to be going back down the Cold War road. And I hope, Jim, that we can discuss this with our participants, but I'm particularly interested in how people feel about this, because it really hasn't been a subject of great debate or discussion during the campaign itself. In any event, it's great to be with all of you. Kitty and I in particular decided maybe it was about time to retire formally from my teaching role, because I was told that I couldn't for the next year be in a classroom with young people. You know, we're well into our 80s now, and we're part of the high risk group. But I want to stay close to Northeast. I want to stay close to my community, obviously, and be as active as I possibly can be in building this better world. And we'll see what happens on the 3rd of November, which happens to be my birthday. And I hope it's going to be a happy one. But in any event, we've got lots to do, and it's just great to have an opportunity for an hour or so to discuss this with all of you. And Jim, thank you for being willing to pull us all together and raise interesting questions and coordinate the discussion. So let's begin. I'll flip it back to you.
Super. Well, I appreciate that, and I'm going to wish you a happy early birthday and hope for the best. So folks, if you've got a question that you want to raise, there are a couple of ways you can do it. You can try to get my attention on the screen, and I'll do my best to spot you. But the most surefire way is if at the bottom of your screen you click on the Participants tab, a menu will pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. And in the lower left-hand corner of that box is a button that says Raise Hand. And if you click on Raise Hand, I will see that you've got a question, and I'll be able to take you in order, and we'll go from there. But so while folks are maybe thinking about what they would like to ask Governor Dukakis, let me just start with a sort of a question that I wish we were talking about. There are a lot of folks who are concerned that if Donald Trump wins re-election, he will withdraw the United States from NATO. And it seems to be part of a bigger challenge with President Trump, and that he seems to have an affinity more for authoritarians than he does for Democrats, little d Democrats. I'm wondering your thoughts about this 21st century, the continued utility of an alliance like NATO, and the relationship that the United States should have with democracies versus not democracies.
Well, I'd even expand that to some extent, Jim, and say our relationship with the United Nations. I mean, I am a huge believer in what I call international governance. the ability of the nations of the world to come together and to solve their problems peacefully. I just don't see, I thought we were moving in that direction pretty well under Obama, and the Paris Accords and the negotiated agreement with Iran seem to be steps in the right direction. And all of that has disappeared under this guy. He not only has an affinity for dictators, and our approach to things like the Saudi Arabian cutting up with a power saw of a guy who was a journalist located in the United States, and so on and so forth, is just appalling. But I want to see us get back to a world in which we are sitting with folks, listening to them, reasoning with them, and seeing if we can't create what I call a kind of form of international governance, which at least makes it possible for our kids and grandkids to live in a world that deals with real problems, one of which quite obviously is climate change. And we're already seeing the consequences of that, but more importantly, a world in which people sit down and resolve their differences peacefully, even if they have different approaches to government. And I think, I don't think I'm being a dreamer here. I mean, I think this is entirely possible, and I would argue essential if we're going to have the kind of world that we want to leave for our kids and our grandkids. So I'm very concerned about where the Trump administration is coming from. I don't know what Trump's foreign policy is these days, to tell you the truth. And I obviously hope if Biden wins that we get back to where we were in a very promising way, I thought, before Biden was elected.
So I see Lionel Silberman has a question. So Lionel, if you want to unmute your microphone and ask the question of the governor, super.
Yeah, thank you. And thank Brookline Adult for providing this forum. And it's a pleasure to see you again, Governor Dukakis. I'd like to pick up on what you said about where we're going. Let's assume some good news November and Biden is president, and let's assume in terms of getting back to norm and foreign policy, what can we do to repair the, I guess if I'm a foreign government, the faith in the United States, that even if we rejoin the Paris Accords, or if we commit more money to the United Nations or NATO, that 4 years from then, we won't go back on that all again. What consistency, if you will, of the United States. It seems like that's one of the big, well, you get the question.
Well, it's a real question. And I suppose the easy answer is I hope we'll return to where not just Obama, but a number of presidents, including Republican presidents, one in particular who defeated me, and who I didn't think was a particularly effective domestic president, but who was a pretty good foreign policy president. And George H.W. Bush, you recall, was the guy that sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev and ended the Cold War and talked about a new world order in which presumably we and other nations would resolve our differences peacefully. And I think that's still a very strong feeling that most Americans have, but it's obviously not something that the guy in the White House feels strongly about. On the contrary, he seems to like or love dictators and isn't interested in what I've referred to as international governance. in which nations come together and resolve their differences peacefully. And I think that's absolutely got to be one of the priorities of any American foreign policy that we're serious about. Because the alternative, I mean, what is going on at this point? I mean, what's going on, for example, in a place like Libya? I mean, it's I don't even understand who's on what side and for what reason. And that's not the kind of world that I think most of us would like to live in. I think we'd like to live in a world that can resolve its problems peacefully and do so in a way that's fair and lifts people up. And it's obvious that that's not the kind of leadership we're getting these days from the fellow in the White House. So this is obviously, it's one of the reasons why this election is so important, but more importantly, why I want to see our country, my country, your country, providing real leadership when it comes to building this kind of future, especially for our kids and grandkids.
Governor, I've got a couple of notes here from your admirers who would like you to tilt your camera a little bit down so that you're a little bit, they can see, they want to see more of you. We can just see your head right now. There you go.
Sorry. Okay.
No, much better, much better. Lisa Hillenbrand has a question.
Hi there. Hi, Governor, and thank you so much for being with us. I was thinking about your campaign for president and the infamous Willie Horton ads that arguably cost you the election. And I see those kinds of race baiting today, and I'm wondering what today you'd recommend we do to counter that kind of horrible, racist, alarmist messaging that's coming from a lot of Republicans today.
Well, one of the big mistakes I made in the '88 campaign was making a decision early on that I would not respond to the Bush attack campaign. And it's clear that you can't do that, especially with a guy like Trump. But even in Bush 1's case, it was just a serious mistake on my part to think that I could somehow make it through that campaign and not respond to what was going on. You remember he went after me on the death penalty. Well, he was from Houston. I'm from Boston. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. I don't know why we don't talk about it more. But you know, Massachusetts has the lowest homicide rate in America. You know that? I meet all kinds of people in Massachusetts who don't know that. It's pretty remarkable. A lot of it has to do with significant improvements in policing in Massachusetts. And I know that we're all concerned about policing, and that should include concern here in Massachusetts, but community policing is real in this state. And I'm very proud of the fact that Northeastern was one of the first programs in the country, one of the first universities in the country to have a major in criminal justice. And lots of our police officers and police commanders these days are graduates of that program, but it's by no means the only one. Westfield State is an excellent one on the western part of the state. The professionalization of policing has been an important part of this, but Massachusetts has the lowest homicide rate in America. And I never said that. Houston, by the way, where Bush was from, had one of the highest. They had the death penalty. We didn't. We had the lowest homicide rate, one of the lowest homicide rates at the time. Kind of not a particularly effective way to deal with that kind of problem. I mean, the Willie Horton thing was, you know, pretty obvious, wasn't it? I never said anything about that either in any kind of direct sense. So those were mistakes made, but I do think it's important to emphasize the fact that this state and other states like it, and frankly, the country generally, has had a significant decline in violence, much of it because of improved policing, professionalization, got to continue. But it's an important part of who we are, and we ought to talk about it more. And I don't hear enough of that, frankly. Now, I don't know that I've answered your question, but and I've wandered around a little bit here, but I do think that we should be talking more about the kinds of things that we are doing to make this country safer, better, and a good place to live, raise your kids, and do good things.
Well, you took the higher ground, and the more.
Oh, yes, but you're nice to say that, but the fact of the matter is that if somebody's coming at you with the kind of stuff that Bush came at me, you've got to have a carefully thought out plan for and strategy for not only responding, but turning the attack campaign into a character issue on the guy that's doing it. And I just totally failed to do that. So shame on me.
Well, it feels like we're again getting into character issues with the Supreme Court slot that in 2016, people had one point of view and now a completely different one. And it does feel like values and character are very much integral to this election.
Yeah, well, I mean, the hypocrisy of that position is you know, you don't have to be a genius to figure it out here. I mean, you know, Lindsey Graham, I mean, have you ever seen anything quite like this?
No.
Consistency is not his middle name. But look, we've got a very good opportunity to win this thing, to get Trump out of there, and to get back to the kind of government that I think most of us would like to see, and just got to keep working at it. Kitty was writing postcards to people in Florida today. So we're all at it, doing the best we can.
Governor Dukakis, I wonder if you know, there are some pockets in the Democratic Party that perhaps see Vice President Biden and Senator Harris as not the purest of the pure progressives. What do you say to them?
Well, you got to be pretty careful about demanding purity of public officials. I mean, I'm a guy who I think on the whole has been able to manage my political life and the work that I've done in government, I hope with a high degree of integrity. But you know, you're not going to be perfect, and if you are looking for perfection, you're going to have a tough time finding it in an election like this. And I say that with a lot of respect for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I think they're a good ticket. They're good people. I like who they are. I like their values. I like what they've done in their lives, and so on and so forth. But frankly, I think the Democratic Party has achieved a degree of remarkable unity, all things considered, in a relatively short period of time. I mean, who would have thought that we would have had a ticket with strong support within the party generally as quickly as we did? And it's been a huge advantage, it seems to me, in the course of this campaign. Let's just hope it continues. But again, don't expect perfection. You know, you're going to have some differences, and one of the things that we want to keep doing is making sure that we bring people together and create consensus, not just within the party, but within the country itself, which is badly divided at this point, and I think needs some real work when it comes to bringing people together again. One of the things that I found, and it's interesting, I'd like to tell this story a little bit, because, you know, when I first got elected from Brookline in 1962, I was part of a band of young reformers at a time when Massachusetts had one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt states in the country. And I won't bore you with what was going on at the time, but just one quick example. I was having a discussion with some of my old pals and associates, and some who go back even before I do or did, and they told me that back in my younger days, before I came to the legislature, maybe even when I don't know, maybe I was there, that if you wanted a bank license in Massachusetts, it cost you $30,000. I mean, and I don't mean in licensing fees. That was kind of news to me, to tell you the truth, but it gives you some sense of just, how corrupt things were at the time. That isn't the case anymore. Yes, every once in a while somebody does something that he or she shouldn't do, but it's a whole different government these days, and on the whole, much more competent, much more committed. One of the reasons I love teaching at Northeastern is because it gives me an opportunity to work with young people who are going to become and are becoming excellent public servants. We didn't have that back in the 60s when I first got into office. So we've made some very real progress, I think, in so many ways, and we should recognize that and celebrate it and encourage younger people to get even more deeply and actively involved professionally in government.
Jeffrey Holzer, and I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, sir, has been waiting very patiently to ask a question. Jeffrey.
That was perfect. Thank you. It's nice to see you again, Governor. We used to ride the Green Line together back in the early 70s. I'm curious, when you were a candidate for president, and it's hard for me to believe 32 years ago, did you receive regular briefings from the CIA, NSA, or United States military about what kinds of things were going on in the world?
I had only one serious briefing by the then deputy CIA director, who subsequently became Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. He was a very good guy. The briefing itself was not particularly helpful, to tell you the truth. I didn't learn much. Those were the days when, who was it? Who was the dictator in Panama?
Noriega.
Yeah, Noriega was one of our pals, but it was. I thought it was kind of perfunctory and wasn't particularly helpful. And that was the extent of my briefing, if you will, with from, in this case, the CIA and the intelligence community. That was it. Who's next?
Governor, I've got another question for you. I'm thinking about sort of these critical tensions within the sort of the Democratic coalition. For decades, the Democratic Party and even the Republican Party, there was a great consensus about the value of free trade. It seems that in the last half dozen years, that coalition favoring free trade and really the powerhouse of globalization has fallen apart. What do you think the future is of trade as an instrument of American foreign policy is, and what do you think it should be?
A lot of this has to do with the guy that's currently in the White House. I mean, who discussed tariffs seriously before he arrived in office? Tariffs. I mean, the last time we raised tariffs to try to save the American economy was in 1931 with something called Smoot-Hawley, and it was a disaster. And in this country certainly has been a leader since that time, for the most part, in advocating free trade. But if you're going to advocate free trade, then you've got to have economic policies that help you to compete and compete effectively, and not be raising tariffs and trade barriers and that kind of stuff, which is essentially what the Trump philosophy apparently is. I think we can compete with the best of them. I think we've got to invest in new technologies. I think we've got to modernize our economy. We've got to be out there. But I think this notion that somehow tariffs are going to protect us from competition is I mean, it goes back to Smoot-Hawley and with disastrous consequences. And that's, among other things, one of the things that seems to me Trump doesn't understand, doesn't really grasp. And so what are we doing here? You know, taxing the American people with because we're the ones that are paying for these trade barriers, basically, with a kind of, you know, back to Smoot-Hawley attitude. I mean, it makes no sense at all. We're subsidizing, what, billions, pouring billions of dollars of subsidies into farming in the United States because of the consequences of this new, if you will, trade policy. Doesn't mean that I don't think we've don't have problems with China and other countries, and I think we've got to work at them and work hard at them, and do so in an international context. And I think we were doing that to a very great extent until Trump showed up. And now we have this protectionist stuff all over again, which isn't helping us and isn't helping the world. But it's got to be fair, free and fair. And that's why our involvement in the World Trade Organization is so important, and China's membership in the World Trade Organization, which we, as you recall, supported very strongly and advocated for, is an important part of this. Now, all of that has kind of been laid to one side here as Trump gives us this protectionist stuff, but it's not helping our economy. We can compete with the best of them. We've just got to make sure we do so. And I hope we will get back to that if Biden's elected.
Lisa Hillenbrand.
You mentioned how critically important issues like climate change are, and we seem to have such a fragmented, fractured system with Congress, the Supreme Court, that we don't seem to be able to have the will to tackle something like that. So I'm curious about some of the bold ideas that are percolating up recently around things like adding DC and Puerto Rico as states, increasing the Supreme Court, getting rid of electoral college. What do you see, if anything, the changes we need to make to be able as a country to act in a more unified way against the big global challenges like climate change?
Well, we should have gotten rid of the electoral college 120 years ago. It was basically a way to bring the slave states into the Union. And I've always thought the electoral college made no sense at all. And by 1825 or so, we should have gotten rid of the thing. Here we are. We've had 2 national elections now where the guy that won or the woman won the popular vote didn't get elected. What is this? It's absolutely ridiculous. And there's a danger that it might happen again this time around. I mean, this is ridiculous. You know, when you've got a candidate for the presidency arguing that people should not vote by mail because if you let people do that, the Republicans would never win another election. I don't think that's probably the case, but in any event, it tells you something about this system. So I get rid of the electoral college. I don't see many other what I call structural issues of this kind in the way of building the kind of world that I've been talking about and that I think most of us strongly support. One of the interesting things that I learned as governor, and it took a while, is that especially if you're in a position of political responsibility, governor, president, mayor, you have an ability to bring people together that's pretty extraordinary. Took me about 20 years, frankly. You know, I was a big reformer when I came to the legislature from Brookline, and there were about 20 or 25 of us young, mostly Democrats, but some Republicans as well. And we were kind of the reform bloc in the legislature. And we did a lot, especially in the 60s, to change things. We had a 2-year term for governor. The governor who was in the government could be of different parties. I mean, we had something called the Governor's Council that practically had to give the governor permission to go to the bathroom. I mean, it was a pretty ancient form of government. And we changed all of that. But it wasn't until I got defeated for re-election the first time and did some hard thinking about why that happened. Because I had inherited a terrible economic and financial mess, and I thought we had done a pretty good job. I think our unemployment rate went from 12% down to 5% just in 4 years, and we were working our heads off, and I lost. And I came to the conclusion that I was a pretty good talker, but I wasn't a particularly good listener. And what you discover is, for one thing, listening is much less tiring than talking. And secondly, you learn things by listening to people. And I became a much better listener. And I began creating what I called working groups when we had a problem. Pretty simple, right? Ask people, including folks that didn't necessarily agree with me, to come together and see if we could solve these problems with working groups. And it was remarkable how effective they were. Reaching out to people and saying, hey, I need your help. I don't care whether you've been with me or not. And politically, I need your help. And the vast majority of Americans really do want to solve problems. They really do want to solve problems, especially if the president, the governor, or whoever asks them to participate in coming up with solutions. Now, you're not going to solve all the problems, that way. This abortion issue is, for a lot of people, an important issue. 70% of the American people basically believe that women should have the right to choose. But it's obvious that we're in the middle of another one of these battles over the whole issue of abortion. But with rare exceptions, I mean, take healthcare. Is there anybody in the United States that doesn't think that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable healthcare? Think about it. And yet we're on the verge, potentially, of repealing the Affordable Care Act. If you went out and took a poll tomorrow and said, should working Americans and their families have decent, affordable health care, what do you think the numbers would look like? 93% of the American people would say yes. Well, if you start with that kind of basic agreement, finding a solution should not be that difficult. And it'll be up to the next president, I hope a new one, who will make sure that, in fact, we move in that direction. But isn't it remarkable that with that kind of agreement on a basic issue like this, we haven't been able to come up with what every other advanced industrialized nation in the world has had for years, and that is universal and affordable healthcare. And I hope I know it's at the top of the agenda of the Democratic ticket. It's obviously not at the top of the Republican agenda for reasons I don't understand. And I'm assuming, as it was in the midterms, that the healthcare issue will be a major issue as we head for the 3rd of November. And as I'm sure you've noted, Trump keeps saying he has a great health plan, but he can't tell us what it is, because he doesn't have a great health plan. He doesn't have a clue as to what he wants to do when it comes to healthcare. And I don't even think he understands it's a tough issue. But a good president who brings people together can get us a good, solid, affordable health plan. And this notion of working groups, bringing people together, asking them to help you solve problems, really does work if you take that approach. And I found, you know, in my last term that there was almost nothing we couldn't do if we put a working group together and sat folks down and had a discussion and went to work. Good staff, very important. It's really remarkable what you can do.
Governor Dukakis, I wonder, this is maybe a high concept question, but I want to take you back to 1987, 1988 as your candidate for president of the United States. I want to ask you a question in that context, and I want to ask you a question, that same question about 2020. But when you were thinking about being commander-in-chief of the United States and the president with all of the foreign policy responsibility that entails, did you think about what you thought the greatest asset that you would have in your arsenal might be? And I'm not talking about defense arsenal. I'm just talking about the things that the United States brings to the world. And if we fast forward to 2020, what do you think our greatest asset in engaging with the world is now?
It's a very good question, Jim. Prior to the election of Donald Trump, I think our greatest asset was not perfection, but a sense that we were good people and a good nation. This is Kitty Dukakis wandering around in the back here. That we were well-intentioned, that we weren't perfect, but people looked to us, I think, with a certain amount of respect and optimism and hope. That's totally gone under this guy. Totally gone. I mean, who would have thought that we'd have our longtime allies basically saying, "Hey, we don't want to spend any time with this guy. We'll go out and do the best we can without him." I thought, for example, feel free to disagree, but I thought that the work that John Kerry, among others, did in negotiating the agreement with Iran was spectacular, and I was very proud of him. And remember, folks, in case you guys are too young, I remember it. We killed Iranian democracy in 1953. Iran was the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. Long tradition. And we deliberately overthrew that democratic government because the Brits asked us to do it. And a guy named Churchill, great man in many ways, but an imperialist to the core, was the guy that convinced Dwight Eisenhower to use the US as an important factor in the overthrow of Iranian democracy. If you want to know why Iranians don't like us, or at least, and many of them still do, but a lot of them don't, it has everything to do with 1953. This interventionism that we seem to engage in. I don't think that's consistent with where the US should be coming from and leading. So, and I think that there still is a significant amount of goodwill about us, although we're losing it, obviously, under this guy. And I hope we can get back to it, because we must be an important force for peace and progress in the world. And it's not that we're the only folks that can do that, but we have a very important role to play, in my opinion, as a force for progress and for consensus and for a world that solves its problems peacefully. I don't think I'm being idealistic, hopelessly idealistic. I really mean that. We have too many other problems like climate change. If you haven't read the New York Times magazine on Sunday and its lead article on climate change, read it. If it doesn't stand the hair on your head, then you're not understanding this. I mean, what is going on with the international environment is serious and very, very troubling. And that's what we ought to be working hard at. And
So I wonder if you have thoughts about why that issue is so hard to communicate effectively to the American public. So in the run up to the Obama administration, I was working at a think tank in Washington, D.C., and we had a whole project on climate change as a national security issue. And with a very straight face, we were able to sign up a whole lot of intel professionals and retired military officers to say, yeah, this is a real complicating factor for the United States and the world. But the public seems so easily swayed by either disinformation from the petroleum industry or the coal industry, or just from perceptions that their own personal economic fortunes are going to be so challenged by a change from a carbon-based economy. How do we communicate this in a way that actually makes progress on this issue possible?
I think it's a darn good question, but I think people are listening. People are listening. I think you're going to see a major increase, as we did during the midterms, from young people between the ages of 18 and 30 in this election. There was a dramatic increase in turnout and, by the way, party affiliation. I think in 2016, young people in the United States voted pro-democratic by 6 points. 20 points in 2018. 20 points in 2018. They care. And I will be very much surprised if they aren't a major factor in this election, largely around the environmental issue. I thought, I was a supporter of Ed Markey's, but I'm a fan of Joe Kennedy's. And I thought one of the reasons, I think it's pretty clear that one of the reasons that Markey won that race was because people identified him with key environmental issues, and rightly so. I mean, been working at these kinds of issues for a long time. But I think it's going to be a major issue on the 3rd of November. I really do. And especially to repeat among young people, who I expect are going to be much more deeply involved in this election than they were in previous elections, with the exception of 2018. We'll see. But this is no laughing matter, and people are beginning to get it. And I'm not surprised that senior government officials, military folks, and so forth don't recognize this. They see it. They understand it.
Yeah.
It's critical.
Yeah, we had a retired Navy admiral who said he could reach out and touch anything he wanted to on whatever coastline he was off of, but he couldn't do anything about changing the way the crops were growing that year, because that was all climate related. And it boiled down to that. We've got just a couple of minutes left here. I want to make sure that folks who have questions that they want to get on the table have an opportunity to do so. I could ask you questions all night, sir, but I think people want to hear more from you than they want to hear from me.
How about some of the rest of you?
I've got one other question I'd like at least to get on the table then. Here's Robin LaFrance. Robin, if you can unmute your microphone.
Hi there. Sorry, you caught me off guard. Before we end, I just wanted you to say a couple of words about Brookline and how Brookline has changed over, say, the past 40 years when I lived there. Thank you.
That's it?
That's it.
Well, lots of people have contributed to this, and it's a great town. Unfortunately, it's a town that is tough to afford these days. I don't want to make you all feel unhappy, but Kitty and I in 1971, having lived and rented an apartment in a big old wooden 6-family building on Perry Street in Brookline, literally moved next door to the right-hand half of a 1875, I guess we call it a duplex, 2 10-room singles with a common firewall. And we've been there ever since. What do you think we paid for our unit? And we, by the way, got friends, Ann and Warren Wacker, some of you may remember them, who bought the other half. We each paid $25,000 for a 10-room single with a common firewall. What do you think that property's going for these days?
Oh my gosh, millions, yeah.
Far in excess of $1 million. I mean, it's just so, we're okay, but how do our kids and grandkids live on Perry Street in Brookline? I mean, we got issues here. I mean, in fact, town's so desirable that everybody wants to move here. And that, by the way, is happening to Boston. The same reason. And I don't buy this notion that somehow as a result of the virus and what's affecting us, that people are going to move to the suburbs. I don't believe that at all. I think folks want to be in the city and they want to stay there. And so our challenge, among other things, is providing affordable housing that average folks can pay for and live in. As we, see this going on. But I mean, think about it, $25,000 for a 10-room single in 1971. 10 minutes from the tee. And
it's a good investment, sir.
To be sure, but where do you go? We're not going anywhere, but it's a wonderful town, and Kitty and I both grew up here. As a matter of fact, Jim mentioned the fact, or somebody mentioned the fact, that I had run the marathon when I was 17 as a high school senior. Interesting experience. A record field of 300, 1951. Now it's 30,000. And there was no shoe made to run on hard surfaces. I and my buddy Reed Wiseman, who was another cross-country runner, ran that race in low-ked sneakers. And we did pretty well, around 3.5 hours. And I think he was ahead of me by, so he was 45th, I was 57th or something. These days he'd get you in at about 5,000. But what was important about that day, among other things, was that it was the first time I'd ever met Kitty. She was a freshman in high school. I was a senior. I didn't know her. I'd heard about her. And I was dying of thirst coming down Beacon Street. We knew nothing about exercise science or any of this kind of stuff. And you didn't drink water at a cross-country race. But this was, cross-country races in those days were 2.5 miles, and this was 26. And by the time I hit Beacon Street, I was dying of thirst. And Kitty was one of dozens and dozens of high school kids who were nice enough, in her case, to run into the Brighams. Remember the Brighams on Beacon Street? And get me a cup of water. She remembers that. I don't, but it's the first time we met. And the rest, as they say, is history. So, little story there. Yeah.
I wanna wrap up with one question, because one of the things that I have been a great admirer of yours. I mentioned to you before we started that I met you in passing in 1988. But one of the things that I've always admired about you is the idealism and the sincerity and earnestness of service that you have brought to every moment of your public career. And I wonder if in what seems to be an incredibly cynical age, if you have any reflection on the enduring value of those ideals in our public life in 2020?
Well, let me say a couple of things. And first, the quality and caliber of people in government at the state and local level is light years better than it was back when I first started, especially in a place like Massachusetts where we really had serious corruption problems. But just generally, and I'm not knocking our predecessors. All I can tell you is that a combination of things, including, by the way, the involvement of colleges and universities in the training of public servants, made a huge difference in the quality and caliber of folks that worked for us. And I was one of the people that was part of that new generation. Now, don't ask me why, how did a kid whose parents had come over from Greece in 1912 and 1913, who did extremely well. I mean, my parents were really remarkable people. My mother was the first Greek girl ever to go away to college unescorted in the history of the United States. Went to Bates College on her own in 1921, unheard of at the time. My dad came over here at the age of 15, couldn't speak the language, didn't have a nickel in his pocket, graduated from Harvard Medical School 12 years later in 1924. So I was a very, very lucky guy. But I think part of it was my parents, part of it was just what we faced in those days. People of color could not live in the town of Brookline when I lived here, when I grew up here. Just couldn't live here, with 3 exceptions. 2 janitors and their families who lived in the basement of apartments, and a world-renowned tenor who somehow got somebody on Pill Hill to sell him a house. That was it. That was it. And don't ask me why at the age of 9 or 10, as I began thinking about these problems, I got mad. Why couldn't these people live in the town of Brookline? Why did they have to go over to the other side of the railroad tracks in Roxbury if they wanted to live in Boston? Now, doesn't mean everything's wonderful, but I can tell you this, it's changed dramatically, and it's changed in part because, and it's still changing, needless to say, because good people decided they were going to do something about it. And don't ask me why I had that strong urge, but I did, and I've never regretted it, except for the fact that I blew the election in 1988. But it's not, it's not difficult to go to work and do good things in government. And fortunately, I was blessed with wonderful people who worked with me, and I'm still at it, and going to stay at it until somebody says it's time to quit. So, thanks to all of you and for being part of this, and stay at it. And let's hope we get some good news on the 3rd of November.
You're here. Well, sir, we are all the better for your service, so we want to say thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for letting me be a part of this night tonight. And with that, I'm going to pitch it back over to Michelle McGlone.
Yeah, thank you again. This was wonderful, very insightful, very thought-provoking, which is what we wanted. And we're so appreciative that you decided to spend your evening with us. We are going to be having a couple more lectures this next few days. We have Julie Shapiro, who will be talking about public health and bats. We figured that was a timely issue given the coronavirus perhaps was generated from a bat originally. And then we have attorney Ken Feinberg, who was the Special Master for U.S. Victims Compensation Funds, will be joining us on Wednesday, the 30th at 7 o'clock. I think that also will be another really insightful and informative discussion. He's going to be talking with us about whether or not the nation can expect a victims compensation fund for the coronavirus. And then he'll be talking also about his work with the Boston One Fund after the bombing at the marathon. So I hope that all of you can join us again for another wonderful evening. And, again, thank you, Governor Dukakis, for everything, and for Dr. Ludes for facilitating this. And we hope to see everybody again soon. Have a great evening.
Thank you all. Great to have a chance to chat with you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.